See how this. Okay. Tonight, I just briefly want to talk about something that came up in a discussion today. I'm sitting here with my friend Michael. Not a discussion with him, someone else actually, but something that I've thought about a lot over the years, which is this question of whether or not Chinese medicine is a science, which is a little bit of a tricky question because it involves the question, what is science? Which these days I think we all sort of take for granted that we know what science is. You know, science is a method of experimentation, or science is it's the study of nature, the experimental study of nature, something like that. But there's lots of experimental studies of nature, and right, and what constitutes a scientific experiment versus some other type of experiment. And then, so we have to define what science is in order to understand whether Chinese medicine fits that category. And as much as we take for granted the idea that we all kind of just sort of know what science is, actually, there's a lot more ambiguity to the term than is readily apparent. The term science was actually only coined or only started to be used at the end of the 1800s, really. And prior to that, the experimental study of nature in the West was generally called natural philosophy. So what the sort of precursor to modern science was considered a branch of the field of philosophy. Now, today we tend to think of philosophy in a rather narrow sense as a kind of a purely sort of intellectual and academic study, which is speculating about various matters that are not to us sort of scientific, in that that we think of philosophy not as being kind of experimental in this way. But historically, philosophy was an extremely broad field and included all sorts of different disciplines, and natural philosophy was one branch of it. There's also something called natural theology in the West, which was the study of nature for sort of religious purposes. Christianity was many of the church fathers, like Augustine and Aquinas, thought very highly of the sort of investigation of the natural world as a way to understand God. The idea being that the natural world, like everything, right? Everything is sort of written by the hand of God. And so to investigate God's works is to potentially gain insight into the nature of the divine, to sort of know God by his works. And this was so much the case that some of the church fathers actually suggested that one could know God equally through investigating the natural world as one could by reading scripture. That's quite a big claim, and certainly not the way that I think modern Christians usually think of things, especially because today there's a perceived conflict often between sort of doctrinal Christianity, or certainly more of the orthodox forms of Christianity, or orthodox forms of religions in general today, and science. But indeed, the two actually grew from the same root, but we often forget this. Today, there's this sort of modern myth of a long-standing conflict between science and religion, which is actually not historically accurate. And even a lot of the instances that people point to as kind of key moments in this conflict are not actually really conflicts between science and religion. Such as the church's turn against what was it, Galileo? It was Galileo, right? That the church
Yeah, they persecuted him.
Yeah, Galileo was persecuted by the church for basically and forced to sort of disown his view of a heliocentric universe, a view that the Earth revolved around the sun, coming from Copernicus. Now, this is often seen as an instance of sort of a conflict, an early conflict between science and religion, between the Catholic Church and science. But indeed, Galileo it was Galileo, right? It was Galileo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Galileo was himself a Christian, and many of the fathers of modern science, Newton, Galileo, Kepler, all of these men were Christians, and many of them, even like Newton, wrote about his studies as a way of understanding the nature of God. Kepler was involved in certain kind of occult disciplines, which were connected in various ways to Christianity and to religion. Of course, Newton was also famously an alchemist. Anyway, those are all asides, but basically the point is that the early study of nature in the West, and not just early, I mean for over 1,000 years, was one, integrated with religious traditions, and two, well, and was sort of integrated with philosophy, and thus doesn't quite fit our modern conception of what science is, as an investigation into the purely material workings of nature. Yet so all of the people we think of as the founders of modern science, these Enlightenment scientists like Galileo, Newton, and Kepler, they all were actually understood at the time to be natural philosophers, not scientists as we conceive the term now. And so the term science actually was only coined, I believe it was coined by William Whewell. I think that's how you say his name, William Whewell. Guy, a scientist at the end or in the 1800s, maybe mid 1800s, and who essentially looked at all these different fields in the field of natural philosophy and wanted to consolidate the investigation into the material workings of nature and have kind of one term. And mainly this term was designed to exclude certain other fields of inquiry. So the term science was in some ways created as a term of exclusion, right? It was a way to get rid of sort of natural theology and certain different disciplines which were considered sort of related in some ways, and sort of narrow and tighten the sense of what science really is. And so it did that. Interestingly, this is a bit of an aside, but I think it's quite interesting. The term science comes from the Latin scientia, which was actually listed as one of the virtues in Thomas Aquinas, who's one of the who's a famous Catholic theologian, and as a virtue to be cultivated, similar to the kind of Aristotelian virtues. Aristotle and the notions of the virtues from Aristotle were highly influential in the development of Christianity. And so scientia was actually originally a sort of state of mind, or a cultivated state of mind, to sort of be able to investigate or logically sort of think through things and deduce things. And this was, so the word science actually, interestingly, kind of comes out of a word scientia, which was originally related to a kind of internally cultivated quality, as opposed to a method for investigating the external world, which was heavily linked with a religious tradition. I think that's quite interesting. So anyway, so this word science was adopted in a way of kind of excluding certain areas of study and sort of consolidating a field and professionalizing it, so that now we can have kind of professional scientists. And that's what we have now. So it's not actually as old of a thing as we think it is. Natural philosophy, even though many of the natural philosophers of the Enlightenment we now think of as the originators of science, they understood their project to be quite different than modern scientists do. They didn't understand themselves simply to be investigating the material workings of nature just to understand material nature. They understood it along the lines of natural theologians, investigating the world of nature in order to gain insight into something divine, potentially. In fact, even the machine metaphor, which today is so ubiquitous in medicine, certainly, and in science, and I'll do a class on that at some point, was originally developed as a theological metaphor, right? If we think of the material universe or even the human body as a machine, as a mechanical thing, implicit in that metaphor is the idea that somebody built the machine, right? Machines don't just spontaneously generate themselves. They're built by someone, right? In this case, it's God. So the mechanical metaphor is itself actually a theological or religious metaphor, but we forget that a lot today. So interesting to consider. Anyway, so what is science really? Well, it's a question, and later on, this question becomes very, very important, and there's all sorts of debate in the 20th century by philosophers and scientists about what exactly science is. How do you define science? Commonly, it is thought to be a method, it's the scientific method, but actually the term science was used, and this field was kind of consolidated before it was defined by its method. And that's important to understand, because today, when people want to define science, they always say, well, it's a method. But is it? Because actually, historically, the idea that science is defined as a method actually comes later as a way of sort of explaining what science is after kind of consolidating the field. So I think that's quite interesting. And there's philosophy of science is a whole field which I only have some awareness of, and there's debate about whether it is actually accurate to really define science and scientific study by its method. But for our purposes, I think it's fair to, right? We can today identify science as a method of observation and experimentation, which of course is defined generally by the stages of kind of hypothesis, experimentation, and verification. The thing that I always come back to, and I've written about this a bit, and at some point I'll get that writing out into the world, is this this question of what a method of experimentation is. And in truth, what a method of experimentation is it's a method of observation, right? We have to observe the world in order to experiment upon it. And so then we are experimenting on something that we're observing, and then we are observing the results. And then, of course, we are taking note of that and reaching certain conclusions from that. So science, of course, is empirical. Empirical in this case, meaning that it is based on human perception, right? It's something that is based on something we perceive. Today we often think of science as being this sort of privileged, this area of study that gives us this privileged access to kind of objective reality, the world as it is outside of our perception of it, like peeling back the veil on the world of nature. But that's not really accurate. What science really is a highly refined form of human perception, right? Because when we do science, we're experimenting upon and observing the world as we perceive it, right? It's just a very refined way of kind of investigating the world as we perceive it. But it's not as though science is getting us beyond the world as we perceive it. It's just a more nuanced and thorough way of investigating the perceived world. And I think this is really important, because when we understand this, we understand that science is fundamentally an extension of subjectivity. It's not a method to get us outside of subjectivity. It's a method for further investigating the world as it is disclosed to subjectivity. Now, of course, people will say, but the special thing about science is that is this question of verification, right? We hypothesize, we do an experiment, and then we can verify it by repeating the experiment, and that's what makes it legitimate. I can do the experiment and I can perceive the results, but then so can my friend Michael, so can someone else. Thus, that gives us a sense, well, it can be perceived by multiple subjectivities, therefore it must be more substantially real. That may be the case, but it doesn't mean it's getting us at something that is outside the field of human perception. Rather, it's saying that science is a method that is defined by the fact that its results can be, well, measurable, of course, and repeatable, such that multiple human subjectivities can re-experience these results over and over again. Sorry, this is becoming a super heady discussion, but it's relevant to Chinese medicine, I swear. Because, and just understand that this is the character of science is really important, right? It's more true to say that science gets us to an intersubjective truth than an objective truth. And what I mean by intersubjective, this is a term that comes from Husserl, a phenomenologist, philosopher. It's been, him and other phenomenologists have been quite influential to me, and I'm currently working on a book sort of using some of those insights from, or some of the terminology and languaging from phenomenology to help us to better understand certain aspects of Chinese medicine, or revisit certain things about Chinese medicine. But basically, it is an intersubjective truth, or an intersubjective acquisition. Multiple subjectivities can converge in agreement on the results of this scientific experiment. I can perceive that when I don't know, put this chemical in this chemical, it had this reaction, and so can Michael, and so can someone on the other side of the planet, and we all agree, right? We all agree that we perceive the same thing happening, but still, it's the world of our perception. So, science is fundamentally a highly refined way of investigating the perceived world, the world as we perceive it. Now, to me, Chinese medicine, similarly, is based on a highly refined way of investigating the world as we perceive it, investigating the body as we perceive it. Now, of course, the language that's used to discuss this world in Chinese medicine is far more metaphorical, usually, than Chinese medicine, or sorry, than in Western science, right? There aren't pretensions in the languaging towards kind of literal representation in the same way in Chinese medicine, in part because the Chinese tradition comes out of and has evolved alongside various spiritual traditions that recognize the futility of language to capture the actual lived world and the world as it's perceived. The first lines of the Tao Te Ching, of course, recognize this, right? The Tao that can be spoken about is not the true Tao. Words are limited. Language is limited, in part because language tends to sort of pretend to deal in kind of universal concepts, and the world as we perceive it is always particulars. It's something I'll talk about another time as well, because I actually think it's relevant to Chinese medicine too. As a geek like me. Anyway, so Chinese medicine is not by any means based on the same method for investigating the world of perception as modern science is, right? It's certainly not. However, it is a highly reformed method for investigating this world of perception. It is a highly reformed method which requires, certainly if you look at the Taoist arts or the cases Buddhist arts, the methods that developed alongside Chinese medicine and which form the basis and bedrock for the insights into the nature of the body, into the nature of the cosmos, into the nature of the energy system in Chinese medicine. These methods are based on highly refined forms of human perception, but not by using external instruments like a microscope or a telescope or an MRI machine or any of these sort of external technologies, but the technology that is highly developed for the investigation of the body that is the basis for Chinese medicine is the technology of human perception itself. So through the embodied practices of meditative traditions, Neigong, Neidan, all of these things, human beings developed higher levels of awareness and insight into the nature of their own bodies and the body and the living bodies of others. And so in this sense, and this is my understanding of Chinese medicine and its origins, and this is borne out, I think, textually, certainly, and also by my own experience and the reported experiences of many I have had the privilege to study with who are far more developed than myself. So is Chinese medicine a science? Well, it depends what you mean by science. Is Chinese medicine developed using the same framework the same exact idea of the method, the scientific method? No. It's not using the scientific method as we think of it in terms of I come up with a hypothesis and then I do a very specific targeted experiment that can be repeated by multiple people using these different technologies of perception, such as external technologies of perception that are used to augment my own embodied perception. No, although arguably a lot of science doesn't even follow that progression so neatly either, right? It's not as though all scientific investigation, what we call scientific investigation or every breakthrough in science, started out with some neatly posed hypothesis and then a particular experiment developed from that hypothesis. It doesn't always actually work that way. But certainly Chinese medicine is not coming out of or based on the scientific method. Certainly the way that the system of Chinese medicine and the view of the body in Chinese medicine is kind of recorded and passed along is different than the way that modern scientific research is recorded and passed along. Modern scientific investigation into the body, they don't then go and say, oh, let's call this thing we found Mount Kunlun or something like that. That's not how we do things. Although even modern science heavily uses metaphors, right? We often forget this, but it as a heavy use of metaphor, right? We forget, but when we say there's a cell wall, like, is that a wall, really? When we talk about the DNA as a code, right? That's a metaphor. That's a computational metaphor. When we talk about the input and the output of the brain, or all these different computational metaphors that are used in modern neuroscience, right? The field of neuroscience developed historically kind of in tandem with the field of computation, of the computer science, and a lot of the metaphors are used interchangeably. But so we easily forget that the brain is not actually a computer, right? It's just a metaphor that we use. It's a very compelling metaphor in a lot of ways, but it's also a metaphor that breaks down in a lot of ways and is not always helpful for the development of neuroscience. So anyway, but the point is, no, Chinese medicine is not a science if we define science in that way. However, Chinese medicine is a system, just like certain parts of Western medicine, many parts of Chinese medicine, right? I wouldn't say all aspects of Chinese medicine historically, but much of it is like Western science and modern science, based on a highly developed, highly refined form of human perception, and a highly refined way, and you could say method, for investigating the world, the world of nature. However, not just the material world as we conceive the material world rather narrowly sometimes today, but the entire world of embodied perception. So that's what I have to say about that. That was a little heady.
I love it. Question about
Michael loved it.
question about I guess it comes down to like the hierarchy of so there's something at least theoretically egalitarian about science and Western view of science. Like, oh, well, we could all kind of follow this method with the amount of if you go to school for 10 years, you'll get there. Like you'll become skilled scientist and then you can verify this for yourself.
Right.
Whereas
and all you need is the proper technologies often to
microscope
to retest these things.
Yeah, but it's like anybody can kind of do it. Maybe it's not true that literally anybody could do it, but you know what I mean, that it's at least theoretically more accessible.
Right. Like anybody could verify this experiment.
Kind of.
If they had the resources.
More or less. The resources, the time.
Yeah.
Whereas the level of highly refined perception that you're describing, a person could seek after for many decades and not achieve, presumably. So, and then it's a matter, or they might delusionally think I have attained some deeper level of insight, but it's delusion.
That's true, and make up a lot of stuff and imagine a lot of stuff, which is what a lot of people think Chinese medicine is based on, right?
Because that's
just people imagining channels and stuff.
It's happened. I mean, people make shit up.
That's
maybe they're not even
undoubtedly true.
Deceiving others, but they're themselves confused and deluded, thinking it's wisdom, it's insight. So that's a
good point.
I think of that as a flaw that Western science feels that it is free of, and that's what's going on.
Yeah, those are great points. I wonder though how free of this Western science actually is, because even I hear you saying a few things. One is like if Chinese medicine is based on kind of higher level, more refined forms of perception of individuals, there's a lot of variation there because different individuals have different capacities, and some of the methods for developing these capacities are going to be accessible to certain people and not to others. That's true. But in the same way, the education, the time, and the resources and the technologies that are needed for verification of much of Western science are also only accessible to some.
Yes.
It's interesting. Like one metaphor I find useful is and this is the case with any kind of meditative practice or contemplative practice or something. In order to test the conclusions of these traditions, in order to test, it's basically what we've been saying, but I think it's a good way of putting it. In order to test the conclusions of the traditions, unlike Western science, maybe you have to build a microscope to look through it to test this thing. In this case, you have to build your own perception in a different way, so you are the microscope. And it's true, if you haven't built your microscope, you don't know. So then you're going on faith. And could people have been making stuff up? Yeah, people could. And could people be making stuff up with Western science also? They kind of could, in the sense that we tend to think that the results of Western science are so objective, but any experiment, of course, the results are still filtered through the biases and subjectivity of the practitioner of science, and the way they're going to interpret the meaning of the experiment is going to be through their own philosophical lens. So if they're a hard materialist, they're going to interpret it that way. Or if they are a deeply religious person, they might interpret it in a slightly different way or something like that, depending on what their assumption is about the world. And it's not as though scientific theories don't change. They've changed radically. These big paradigm shifts in Western science just in the last 100 years, from Newtonian mechanics to quantum mechanics. These are radically different ways of seeing the world through which you would interpret different experiments differently. So,
and another thing as I'm kind of thinking is what studies get funded and what studies change the consensus of the scientific community is another layer of, I think, where maybe Western science isn't free from these dynamics of like, well, there's it's
Totally.
like there's a momentum of Western science of like this is accepted as legitimate, and even if there's a legitimate study that doesn't for whatever reason fit into this the way that things are currently perceived, it might get left out for a very long time.
Totally. Yeah. And there's tons of examples of that, aren't there?
Probably not that I
Yeah.
could name any, but I think there probably would be.
Yeah. Well, neither of us are scientists, but yeah, totally. Totally. But you're right also that there is this danger with this way of framing Chinese medicine potentially, as it could leave room for people to just make stuff up or be lost in, or less nefariously, just kind of be lost in delusion and lost in a kind of imaginal realm of their own and create their own system, which I think is a lot of the more new agey
Yeah.
stuff that is sometimes added to Chinese medicine in the West. You know, in the West, I think there's sort of two ways that Chinese medicine has gone in some ways, because you had this kind of communist rendering of Chinese medicine, which made it very sort of materialistic, that came to the West, and people sort of go one of two ways. One is to go more into the kind of hard science research on Chinese medicine. Let's verify Chinese medicine according to the standards of Western science. The other is to go the opposite way and say, well, let's make it more spiritual, but often that means less grounded in any kind of actual world of perception and real deep investigation, and a little more kind of lost in imagination stuff. Yeah. So it's a danger.
Would you say, are you saying ultimately, so I get what you're saying with Western science as instead of thinking of it as objective, it's intersubjective.
Yeah.
And that totally, I follow that. And that is a profound thing to think about. But then are you saying with Chinese medicine, I would assume there's still a level of intersubjectivity between practitioners at equal level skills or levels of perception. There's still intersubjectivity. Does it arrive at objectivity? Are you saying that have you even addressed this question? Does it go beyond intersubjectivity in a way that
I'm not sure even like how to talk about like how meaningful the term objectivity is outside of the notion of intersubjectivity.
Yeah.
Because I have not yet arrived at an ability to, I don't know what it means exactly to perceive something outside of the realm of perception. Perhaps at some point of profound meditative development, that becomes available and that would make sense to me, but I'm not there. So
fair.
I just have no idea what to even think about such a notion. I think usually when people use the word objective, they're using it in a kind of philosophically sloppy way.
I'm sure I was just now, but I'm just curious if do you think intersubjectivity, well, I guess in Chinese medicine, intersubjectivity would be the same level of intersubjectivity, except
like two people.
Not all subjects are equal.
Yeah, maybe there is a little more of a hierarchy there. Yeah, in the sense that if someone has highly developed perception, their perception it's more valid.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the case even with if someone's trained in reading an X-ray, their perception of the X-ray, film is more valid than the student or something. Yeah, I mean, a very simple example without getting into anything super esoteric is just pulse diagnosis. Some people have highly refined abilities with pulse diagnosis. Someone who has not trained pulse diagnosis for years and has highly refined abilities with that isn't going to feel the same thing when they take the same person's pulse. They're not going to, one person. I recently took a friend to a highly skilled practitioner, and she had she had fibroids on her uterus and didn't tell him, and he took her pulse and said, "Oh, you have fibroids on your uterus." That's pretty good. That's pretty good. I know a number of practitioners who would be able to tell something like that. Someone who's not skilled would take the pulse and would have no idea, right? For someone who's they could barely find the radial artery and feel it, let alone these different positions and these different depths and these nuances of quality. So it is true that there is a hierarchy of the of perception, because certain tools of perception are not as good as others. Just like a microscope is better at looking at certain things than there's good quality microscopes, there's bad quality microscopes. A human being who has cultivated the ability to perceive one thing versus a human being who hasn't to a high degree, it's just different. But yeah, with Chinese medicine, it is intersubjective in the sense that two people who have reached a similar quality of ability to perceive can agree and perceive the same thing. And this is something that I think people who go to a lot of Chinese medicine schools today sort of don't realize, because there's not enough people who are really highly trained, unfortunately, which isn't at all their fault. It's just the education isn't really there. And so it can feel like, oh, well, everyone perceives something different and everyone's perception is kind of equally valid. It's not true. There is it's just the truth. There's people who are better at it than others, and better at certain parts of it than others, and have different developed skills. There's nothing wrong with saying that. I think that in the Chinese medicine community, there's a little bit of a tendency to want to not say that, and pretend that it's maybe more like Western medicine, in that it's like, well, any doctor could order an MRI and read that MRI in a relatively similar way. There's a much wider range of skill available in Chinese medicine. So, which is not to claim myself as someone who has a particularly high level of skill. It's just that I know there is. I've seen it. Yeah. So, any other thoughts? That was a good question.
Well, I guess I don't know if it's a question, but it's a thought, and I'm sure you've had this. And I wonder what it's like as a doctor of Chinese medicine. Maybe people don't say this to you because they don't want to offend you, but I've had conversations with real sciencey types.
Yeah.
Real probably materialist types.
Yeah.
Who really see Chinese medicine as superstitious. Superstitious. And I think they might agree with you to the point of your analysis that you presented of, it's hard to argue with what you said about intersubjectivity rather than objectivity within Western science, because at the end of the day, everything that we are talking about is based on our perception of a sight phenomena,
right? It's empirical
form of empirical thing. So, So then, they might say, well, okay, semantics, maybe we'll call it intersubjective. But the thing is, intersubjective, a lot that you can rest your hat on, because it can really get a lot done. Look around, look at all the advances in this and that in terms of technology or medicine. So, okay, forget it's not objective. We can maybe let that go. I don't know if my science friend would let it go so easily, but maybe he could.
Yeah.
But he could say, okay, we'll get over that word choice. We use intersubjective. But this intersubjective methodology of science, Western science, is producing these things. Look at Chinese medicine. I went to an acupuncturist, or once when in my 20s as a joke, and it didn't do anything. And then I've talked to so many people who've, I don't know, maybe I met one person who said that they got so much out of it, but are they just superstitious? Was it kind of placebo? It's just, you look around, it's a mess. It's nothing.
Yeah.
And so that guy would be probably to you polite, but to me, because I don't have a vested interest in I'm not a doctor of Chinese medicine. He was just like, Chinese medicine is dumb. And then I found myself defending
I've
it.
had lots of people tell me that. Yeah.
I found myself defending it, but I'm not nearly as articulate as
I
you
don't-
in terms of that.
What I would say is I don't feel any strong need to defend it. I actually have never met anyone who said, I've talked to so many people who've been to acupuncturists and none of them got anything out of it. I've never met anyone who said that, but I'm sure that there is someone who feels that way. Have you?
I think
You know some people?
This
Oh,
guy,
you have a particular person
this
in
guy,
mind.
So he used to live here. He doesn't
Yeah.
anymore, but he used to. So around here, a lot of people have done.
Yeah, it's common
So-
around here.
so-
We're in Vermont right now.
Yeah. So I think I don't remember exactly what
He was
said,
unimpressed.
but he would have known many people who've done it.
Sure.
And he was saying, based on his own experience and
experience.
then what he's observed, he's not convinced that there's absolutely, literally any value of
Yeah.
it at all.
Well, he probably shouldn't be convinced. I mean, if that's his experience of it, then
Yeah.
he doesn't have any reason to be convinced.
Yeah.
I mean, I honestly, he doesn't, right? I
No,
wouldn't
he
try to
doesn't.
convince him otherwise. I would tell him my experience.
Yeah.
Right. I
Well,
mean, that's all
that-
you can do, right? I'd say, well, my experience is different. Let me explain my experience.
Yeah.
And he could think I'm crazy, but that's on him. Like, that's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any reason to be a strong like evangelist for Chinese medicine. It's not like a hill I want to die on. When I first started, I felt more of a desire to like defend Chinese medicine against the dominant medical paradigm and these biases against it. But that was more because I was insecure and I didn't have as strong a personal experience of it being profound and working at that time, because I'd just begun studying it. I'd had experiences for myself of it being very profound for my own healing, but I had only seen a few other, I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. I think it's often the case that we want to convince others the most when we ourselves aren't fully convinced, because we feel like if they are convinced, then we'll feel certain, we kind of need to get people on our boat.
Yeah.
If we're not sure of something. Once we're sure of something, if someone else doesn't believe in it, we don't need them to believe in it, right? Of course, for like, if I was a politician or I was concerned about public policy and pushing something, if I was arguing or lobbying the state of Vermont to include more acupuncture in its insurance or something like that, that would be different, right? Then I would have to present more of an argument. But I actually think that people are less convinced when you're trying to convince them, and more, I think it's, to me, I don't think there's any reason to try to shove anything down someone's throat. If someone's experience is that it doesn't work, that's their experience. I think there's no reason to tell them their experience or try to convince them otherwise, other than to just tell them that your experience is different, because that's all we can ever do as humans. We're all just experiencing a world and going through this weird life. And I didn't actually really think there was much to Chinese medicine before I started to have my own kind of profound healing experiences with it. I was open to it though. For some reason, I did see acupuncturists who didn't particularly help me. I even saw one person who gave me herbs that made me worse, so I was not convinced exactly, but I also wasn't closed off to the idea that different practitioners might have different things to value, and then different value to offer.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I met someone who had something to offer, I was like, there's something here. And then I met someone else who had something even more valuable to offer, and then just has kept going like that. So I think just sharing one's own experience. Who cares if someone else believes in it? Medicine shouldn't be like a religion to believe in. I don't even think religion should be about belief. That's a video for another time, but I actually think that the modern emphasis on belief in religion is it is modern, and the notion of faith is quite different than the notion of belief. And most traditions throughout the world have historically put much more emphasis on on a kind of embodied personal perceptual engagement with the divine, as opposed to a cognitive sort of textual based doctrinal belief as an identity. So I don't think it's useful to adopt the identity of a Chinese medicine. I believe in Chinese medicine. And I have people say that. I have clients sometimes come and they're like, they really want me to know that they believe in what I do. You know, they're like, I believe in Chinese medicine. I believe in what you do. I don't care. And usually that makes me think that they don't. I mean, I think it's very kind of them to, and they really, you know, but usually when we really want to believe, there might actually be more uncertainty. And what I've found is that's often the case. It's often the case. Not to knock anyone who sees this who feels that way. I think it's great to believe in something. We all need to believe in something. I certainly believe in Chinese medicine, but it's not like a belief in the sense that it's not that I believe in it, actually. I just know it works.
Mm-hmm.
That's different. That's
Mm-hmm.
really different. So anyway, that's what I have to say about that.
So actually, interesting question, follow up to that, I guess, is do you think, certainly you don't think someone has to believe that your treatments will work, or believe in the worldview and methodology and whatever you're practicing for it to work? Do they have to be open to it, do you think? Or not even that? Like, you could be like, this is a dumbass waste of time, this dumbass.
I mean, people come in something like that. They're like,
Uh-huh.
my wife told me to do this. Honestly, I think this is crap. Like, that happens. I would say I'm never really into treating people who don't want to be treated. If someone doesn't want to be treated, sometimes people bring their kids and their kid really doesn't actually want to do it. And I prefer not to treat someone who doesn't want to be treated, unless they decide they get behind it. Obviously, if they're in the office and they're an adult, they've decided to. Even if it's a little different with kids. But no, they don't need to believe in it for it to work. I've certainly made people believers in the sense that they're highly skeptical, and then they're like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. You know, I had no idea. That happens pretty often. And there's something kind of satisfying about that, you know. Mm-hmm. But there is something specifically about acupuncture that the openness of the system, because the mind and body are connected, the level of openness between the practitioner and the client is an aid in the process. It is harder to work with someone if they are not open to you. So even if they're not open to Chinese medicine, if they're open to me as a person, sometimes that does the trick. But that is really, really useful and really important. If someone is like, they're tense and paranoid and I don't like this, I don't want that, you know, it is much harder. And even if I'm just giving herbs, patient compliance is not going to be very high usually. If they just don't think it's going to work, why would they take it, you know?
Yeah.
So it is not necessary that they believe, but it is really, really helpful if they're open. Mm-hmm. If they're open to
it. Maybe especially with acupuncture, but even with herbs too.
Yeah, totally. I'm sure it's the same. I'm sure it's the same with body work in a certain way.
Yeah.
Maybe a little different than something kind of energetic like acupuncture. But if someone is lying on the table being like, this is terrible, this sucks, he's not going to be able to help me, he's a terrible practice, you know, this is all bullshit. It's going to create tension in their body, and that's precisely the tension that you're trying to resolve. So
there's been a few really strange, surprising ones where I'd be working with somebody who, to me, it's very clear they're very not at ease with the whole process.
Yeah.
And, you know, always checking in, like, how are you doing? I'm doing great, whatever. Just
I'm doing great.
Awesome, good, everything perfect, good. And so
I'm over the moon.
assuming the whole thing
This is the best experience of my life.
kind of a dud, you know, in terms of the massage. But then at the end, like, so how was everything? Like, that was so amazing. Like, and really, like, I believe them. I don't feel like they're just trying to
Like something changes.
like something. Even though I feel like that the client isn't open, still sometimes I'm surprised that they got something out of it anyways. But more often than not, that's not the case. More often than not.
I've had that experience too with acupuncture. Sometimes at this point, I can tell if a treatment is working quite well. There's various different ways that I can tell. I mean, pulse for one, but there's also various other things available to me to help me to know some level of what's kind of going on and whether it's working for their system. But there have been times, and I keep evolving as an acupuncturist and a practitioner, so I'm sure this will change, but there have been many times over the years where I give someone a treatment and I'm kind of like, I think that was a shitty treatment. Yeah. And I'm not sure that really did anything. And they get up and I'm like, how was it? They're like, it's okay. And it feels like neither of us really feel that confident that much good was done. And then they come back and it actually really worked. And I'm surprised, you know? So, there's a lot of factors involved, and yeah, I can relate with that. All right, what do you think? Should we round it up? Thanks for joining, Michael.
Absolutely. Thank you, man.
Michael Schneeweiss. I don't know if anyone in Florida will ever see this, but if anyone in Florida ever sees this, Michael Schneeweiss is an excellent body worker in Gainesville, Florida.